It was 2014 when we last benchmarked Ubisoft's Watch Dogs IP, and now with the second incarnation of the game here, we're starting our benchmarks with GPU performance analysis across the entire 10 series from Nvidia and the AMD RX series, along with some older cards from the last generation of hardware from both vendors. There are a lot of cards on the bench, and we spent a good amount of time studying the graphics options to better understand what it is that Watch Dogs 2 finds the most stressful for GPUs and hardware. Before getting to that, this coverage is brought to you by AMD FreeSync displays like the LG 34UM57-P, which is a $350 budget ultra-wide display at 2560 by 1080. Learn more in the link below. Let's start with the Watch Dogs 2 benchmark, and we spent the first hour of the game just looking around and studying how the graphics settings and the different elements within the game impact performance. This is looking for things like meshes, the complexity of them, and their impact on processing ability for whatever card we happen to be testing. Look at texture resolution and the VRAM consumption of that texture, at least so far as we can tell, and other things like shadows and how they impact gameplay, which is actually pretty heavily in this particular game. There's really complex foliage, trees, things like that, and they do interact with light in a very intricate way with Watch Dogs 2. This creates a pretty good representation of how a world would actually interact with the sun, but obviously you've got a pretty big performance trade-off depending on the graphic settings. So that's part of what we looked at, and the full methodology for this benchmarking course is of course defined in the article linked in the description below. So if you're curious about how we tested it, why we tested a certain way, what drivers we used, things like that, it's all down there. I will make one quick note. The drivers used, just because every time it's a question and people don't seem to click the article, the drivers used are brand new. We have access to them normally early. The NVIDIA cards were tested with the latest NVIDIA drivers, the numbers in the article, and those do officially support Watch Dogs 2, and the same is true for AMD, tested with the latest AMD drivers. So that's all done as it should be, and the rest is defined below. Now, getting into things, loosely starting, graphics settings include geometric detail, or the mesh complexity and number of primitives drawn, extra details, which adds to mesh detail and uses a percentage offset to do so. Terrain and vegetation are both next, which also both impact LOD and view distance on their respective elements. So for some specificity, vegetation detail directly correlates to draw distance of those more complex trees that I was talking about, including individual leaves and branches and how far away you can see them. Shadows are a bit interesting as well. Although we primarily tested with core shadow settings, that would be low to ultra, you could also go beyond the presets and configure them to use things like percentage close or soft shadows or high fidelity frustum trace shadows, both of which are NVIDIA technologies that we previously covered in depth, and you can learn more in our coverage of those technologies. The rest is pretty self-explanatory and has varying impact on weather and fog effects, both plentiful in the game's recreation of San Francisco, and generally just a couple of other small tweaks, things like anti-aliasing, which is a large tweak, and then your normal filtration settings. As always, we conduct multiple test passes per device, so for some devices, depending on how many resolutions we test in quality settings, that could be dozens of tests for one video card, and that's to ensure parity. We're looking for deviation, we're looking for consistency in the frame rate measurements, not just from an analytical perspective, but from a gameplay perspective. Can you actually feel the difference one test run or one day to the next when you're playing the game? And that's averaged as necessary, and we of course use our 1% and 0.1% low methodology, which is basically taking the slowest 1% and 0.1% of frames, as I'll define in a video elsewhere, and we look at frame times when doing that, but we look at the slowest percentile metrics and then use that to extrapolate the low end performance rather than a minimum or maximum, which are both outliers and should be ignored. Neither HFTS nor PCSS were used in the larger benchmark charts, though we did take a quick look at them, and that's just really for some fairness between brands and because they're kind of unnecessary technologies and do have an impact on performance. We'll be looking at the game with 1080p Ultra, Very High, and Medium for the 1920 by 1080 settings, and then we'll be looking at 1440p Ultra and 4K with Very High settings. The game was tested near Mission Park in San Francisco, where we mix in cars, grass, and complex trees. We carefully tested at exactly the same time of day with the same conditions, which is a sunny day that casts more shade from the foliage, and that more heavily impacts performance. So yes, it does actually matter quite a lot what time of day you benchmark, if it's raining or not, and what direction the sun is shining depending on where you're walking when interacting with those shadows. Let's get to the first chart. This one's simple. With this chart, we're showing rough performance scaling across settings by aggregating a couple of our mid-range cards. Note that this isn't a perfect representation of how all cards will scale, but it gives a rough idea. Devices with less VRAM, for example, will struggle disproportionately toward the high end, where these averaged here might not. And note also that max settings, the quote-unquote max, is tuned with ultra and then further tuned with extra details max and the shadows set to HFTS. Let's move on to some hard data. Here's our 1080p ultra results. EVGA's GTX 1080 FTW unsurprisingly leads the pack, operating this configuration at about 76 FPS average with lows consistently around 60 FPS. The GTX 1070, a card around roughly $400, is capable of juggling 1080p at ultra settings, and that's with a 64 FPS throughput and closely following lows. No trouble at all for this one. And then AMD's R9 Fury X pushes a frame rate comparable to the 970 SSC, not benefiting noticeably from its HBM. That's not the first time we've seen this performance out of the Fury X either, or its stack up against cards like the 970 SSC. Moving down to the mid-range cards, we're seeing MSI's GTX 1060 Gaming X operating at 45 FPS average, about 39 1% lows, and about 37 0.1% lows. That's fairly tightly timed across the board and remains reasonably playable. We'll look at how a settings reduction supports the GTX 1060 in a moment though. For folks on the GTX 970, as shown here, you'll be at roughly equal performance to a GTX 1060, at least the ones we've tested. And moving to MSI's Gaming X version of the RX 488GB card, the card is producing an average FPS of about 41 with lows at 32 and 28 respectively. Our gaps between averages and lows are a bit larger than on the GTX 1060 here, though the visible difference is not necessarily that substantial at this point. Next, the RX 474GB pushes 35.7 FPS average with 0.1% lows, also somewhat distantly timed. This card begins to exhibit some stuttering during play, and that's a result of frame time disparity and can be resolved largely by a settings reduction. Speaking of, these are our very high charts, and they're a little simplified. The high-end devices remain left to the ultra tests, and at the top of this particular chart, we see the GTX 1060 Gaming X and 970 SSC, both at roughly 60 FPS average. The RX 480 Gaming X follows closely at 56 FPS average, effectively equal to the 970 SSC in performance, and largely insignificant in its differences from the GTX 1060. The new cards on this chart include the GTX 1052GB and RX 462GB. The 1050 non-TI card is pushing a 32 FPS average with sort of rough lows, really. The RX 460 is in similar shape, though worse off at 26 FPS average and 13 FPS 0.1% lows. This manifests itself noticeably in jarring stutters. Just for quick reference, we ran the 1052GB and 462GB at medium settings for a more realistic look at performance, and the result was an output of about 50 FPS average for the 1050 and about 40-45 FPS average for the RX 460, so a lot more playable if you drop down to medium on those cards. 1440p Ultra, it's a bit taxing, but we gave it a shot anyway. The GTX 1080 FTW pushes about 55 FPS average with the lows consistently north of 40. Next, the 1070 runs a 45 FPS average and remains fairly playable with how Watch Dogs 2 is built anyway. And the GTX 1060 Fury X and 970 SSC are all in the stutter range of gameplay, and they would be better matched to a 1440p resolution if using settings closer to high. Given Watch Dogs' intensive settings, we only tested 3 cards at 4K resolution because we were pushing for very high quality. The GTX 1080 FTW isn't quite 4K ready at very high settings, but could do so with a slight settings reduction. 1070 SC would also need to be dropped, though closer to a mix of high settings, maybe a bit of medium, for FPS sustained in the 40s. The Fury X isn't much of a contender here at all and stutters like mad with those low frame rates. But if you really, really wanted it, I suppose you could drop down the quality quite a bit. I would generally prefer a 1440p output with a higher quality in this scenario. So Watch Dogs 2, it's a very intensive game. It's not really that easy on this hardware. Even stuff like the 1080 FTW is struggling at resolutions with quality settings that in other games wouldn't really make it struggle quite so much. And that's not necessarily an optimization issue so much as it is just what's being drawn in the game. I mean, think about it. If we walk by a park, it's drawing tons of grass, and just from looking at it, it seems like most, if not all of those blades are individually interacting with light, with shadows. You walk under a tree with the sun behind you shining down over the character's shoulder, and that's casting a ton of really finely detailed shadows from an already complex tree onto the character. And from a lighting standpoint, it's pretty cool graphics, but it's not easy for a GPU to handle. So this is a game where the FPS does not look quite as impressive as some of the other games we've tested recently. However, Watch Dogs 2, just sort of subjectively speaking here, is one of the games that is fairly agreeable to play in the 40s for FPS. I was really not complaining that much when in the 40-45 FPS range. Obviously a bit higher is a bit better, but it wasn't as big a deal as, say, Battlefield 1, where you really want that high FPS for competitive play. That's not to say Watch Dogs 2 can't be competitive, but certainly with the way the game is designed, the lower FPS is a little bit more agreeable than in some of the higher speed games. So overall, if you're seeing FPS metrics sort of in the mid to upper 40s, that is generally acceptable for the card that you're seeing the numbers for. However, you could always do a slight settings reduction, and in this game, a good place to look for you to start with settings reductions would be things like shadows, because shadows have a huge impact on performance. And then next would probably be things like foliage and vegetation, which, again, a lot of things to draw and a lot of light interactions if your shadow settings are set so that they are interacting. So that's where I'd look. As far as cards that can play Watch Dogs 2, obviously, like always, most things can play, technically. It's just a matter of how low you're willing to go on the settings. So for my notes here, I've got that the 1080p very high settings and 1080p ultra settings look more or less the same when you're actually in the game playing it, not actually sitting there staring, looking for differences between them. But when you're actually playing and engaged, they pretty much look the same. There's a couple differences, but it's not bad. With that said, very high is a lot more playable than ultra in terms of FPS. The jaunt is pretty massive here. If very high is acceptable for you, and it probably should be for most people, then the RX 470 and up are playable on the AMD side. The GTX 970 and up are playable on the NVIDIA side. The GTX 1050 Ti is pretty close. A couple settings tweaks would make it possible to play with fluid frame rates and have good gameplay that's acceptable. And that's with a reduction to the settings, obviously. The GTX 1060 and RX 480 really have no problems at all with 1080p and very high settings. Ultra is a lot harder, and that's really where you're going to need something like an RX 480 or a GTX 1060, and even those were getting by in about the 40s. But like I said, that's okay in this game for the most part. Now, as for the golden standard 60 FPS metric, that's where you've got to push for something like a 1070 SC or thereabouts. AMD current generation doesn't have an equivalent to that, but with the advent of Vega, that will obviously, hopefully, eventually come out. But that's not here today, so we can't really test it. So for today, the 1070 SC looks about right for that settings output. Higher resolutions are pretty rough. Anything short of a 1080 will generally need to operate at a settings reduction. And even the 1080 FTW we've got here, we had to drop the settings quite a bit for 4K to be happy. That was generally in the range of high rather than very high or ultra. So that pretty much sums it up. Now, I know there's always questions of why didn't you test X card or Y card? We've got limited time and we've got limited hardware. I know we've got a lot of video cards, but it's not necessarily the ones that you always want us to test. And then there's obviously, again, limited time. So 980 Ti unfortunately did not make it in today. I would like to test it, and we will probably test it in the future. The same goes for the 960, and the same goes for some of the R9 series cards, like the 380X and the 290X, which I'd really like to test. But we have content pieces for those coming up shortly. So as always, to see those, subscribe for more. Patreon link in the post-roll video. You can click on that to help us directly if you like this type of reporting. The article is linked in the description below for more depth. I'll see you all next time.